Kaitlyn Bretz is a visual analytics specialist within the Center for Sustainable Energy, Transparency and Insights team. Kaitlyn creates visualizations for all program areas. She applies her skills in Tableau and lots of other software to develop dynamic and interactive visualizations for internal and external clients. Kaitlyn completed her Master in Climate and Society at Columbia University in New York City in 2022. And today she's talking about visualizing inequity reshapes the narrative, building skills to improve equity data visualizations. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here, and thank you for sticking around on this Friday afternoon. My name, as Marilla said, is Kaitlyn Bretz, and I am a Senior Visual Analytics Specialist for the Center for Sustainable Energy. All right, let's see. So, the first thing I'm going to be talking about is introducing our center and then diving into where data equity comes into play. Like, why are we dealing with this data and what are we trying to do with it? Next, we're going to look at the CVRP program, which I will tell you and spell out in a little bit. And it goes into how equity is based into that program and who our audience is. Lastly, we'll be diving into the process that we've established over the last 18 months, specifically looking at some framing language, some sample visualizations we've created, some accessibility features, and then lastly, ending hopefully with some takeaways. All right. So, CSE, who are we? We are the Center for Sustainable Energy, and our mission is to decarbonize. So our goal is to basically let people purchase the low-emission, zero-emission vehicles, install distributed energy resources, such as solar panels, and basically try to have a greener world. Oh my gosh. I knew I was going to break it, guys. I just knew it. Haha, we're good. All right. So the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project is our largest program. It is a multi-million-dollar initiative for the state of California to allow people, usually lower-income individuals, to purchase zero-emission electric vehicles. And this is where equity comes in, because how do we determine who is eligible? Now, at the very bottom here, you'll see that CVRP offers two different incentives. One is going to be the standard incentive, and the second one is going to be an increased incentive. And that is the focus of today's talk, is that increased incentive. So, how does California identify the most vulnerable and pollution-burdened areas? Oh my God. There we go. All right, so CVRP started off like over 10 years ago, and its main goal was, again, to just basically improve the adoption of electric vehicles in California. They weren't really concerned about equity. They just wanted to get people like adjusted to EVs and more comfortable dealing with them in their environment and adjusting their lifestyles. But that has changed dramatically. In around 10 years, the focus on equity has increased dramatically, and the fact that the Justice 40 Initiative for U.S. Investment, which is kind of a mouthful, there's been new funding as well as new pushes from policymakers to start reporting key performance indicators for equity communicators. So that is why we're coming in here. We're trying to provide visuals and metrics that prove where are these tax funds going? Are they going to the most vulnerable populations? And then also identify some gaps and opportunities in this program so that we can understand how to improve and expand this program. All right, so our goals as visualizers, there's 3 of us, our tiny and mighty team. Our main goal is to first clearly identify what we mean by equity. This changes between programs and is extremely context specific. So it's honestly the first question that I ask whenever a team comes up to me and says, we want an equity visualization. My first question is, how are you defining equity? Secondly is to identify these visualizations that shift the narrative, to let people look further into equity communities and understand what's going on. And third is going to be integrating accessible features. The United States has a law, ADA compliance. So basically it's accessibility and disability, and because we work with federal and state money, we have to adhere to those guidelines. So we have a huge focus on accessibility features. All right, so with that, I was able to introduce our entire organization, the CVRP program, and now we're gonna jump into some of our work. So our process, I've tried to narrow it down and categorize it into these 6 groups. So again, I just wanna preface that equity is a huge coverage of what equity means and how we're defining it, and I am focusing on a very small part of that, just the visualization aspect. Equity can apply in the program design and the program implementation, as well as advocacy groups and outreach, and I would love to have a conversation about those later, but today I'm narrowly focusing on just these visualizations. So, these 6 items, first we're gonna start off with, again, identifying what equity means. And then second, to identify framing language to orient users. So this is providing items in and around the graph to orient users to understand what's going on in the graph. Third is to be cognizant of the order and grouping of data points so that we're not introducing inherent biases. Fourth is to visualize data. So these are some of the charts that we've been using more often, including proportion plots, some B-swarms, back-to-back visualizations, and small multiples. Next are going to be the accessibility features, so using color appropriately, and then lastly, providing a narrative and acknowledging the story that we're telling. And I do want to thank John for introducing that concept regarding subjective versus objective charts, because where we're coming from, we acknowledge that our charts are completely subjective. We have a goal in mind, and we want to be clear about what message we're trying to get across to policymakers, and then have the data to back that up. All right, so back to CVRP and that question, what do we mean by equity? Now, equity is established at 2 different stages. The first at the eligibility and outreach stage. So this is where we are legislatively and geospatially defining where these communities live. And then we have certain parameters that people need to meet to be eligible to participate in this program. That includes low-income communities and then meeting income by individuals per household. It's kind of a confusing metric, and they do have to report a lot of information to us. Now, we also define equity at the evaluation stage. So at the very end of this program, we ask people to provide survey information so that we can assess with different metrics what's actually going on. So while metrics such as age group, gender, education, housing type, and income, or I guess income does, renters versus owners do not define or limit who can participate in the program, we do want to have a good understanding of who's participating in these programs so that we can encourage policymakers to make adjustments to the program to reach these people. All right, so this is called a Cal screen. This was created by the state of California, and it was basically an index that their team created. They review various numbers of data and then categorize them by census tract, and then together they create an index that ranks communities by vulnerabilities. This, I do want to acknowledge, is a work in progress. We have problems with it that we've tried to kind of negotiate with the state of California, and is basically always in work. This is something that is legislatively mandated for us to follow, so we are very, very, I guess, closely connected with how this tool was built and then how we're implementing it. So the tool is actually online, and it's actually, I think it's hosted by ArcGIS. But as you can see here, we have the typical green, red color scheme, which I had nothing to do with, I promise. And basically, the census tracts that are highlighted in red are going to be the more vulnerable populations as defined by the state of California. You'll see that the Center Valley and Sutherland are kind of highlighted in red, and then if you were actually to zoom in on this map and play around with it, you'd see that a lot of downtown areas or in densely urban areas also have pockets of red. So those are the people that we're trying to engage with in this program and trying to get them to, I guess, open the door and have them be able to enter renewable and sustainable energy. Now, before I jump into more metrics, we're going to cover a list of the items that are being used to generate the Cal screen. So there are 2 things, pollution burden and population characteristics. For pollution, we have a lot more data because California is rather very driven about collecting any and all data. So we have their exposures, and those include PM 2.5 concentrations, drinking water contamination, pesticide use, etc. And then on the population characteristic side, we have instances of asthma, unemployment, cardiovascular disease, and poverty. All right, so this is where I'm actually going to get into some data viz stuff. So our one goal with language and framing is to, one, kind of put a positive spin on these program outputs. We want policymakers to continue funding them because we know that they're doing a good job. And two, to highlight areas of improvement. So here we have a full sentence title that is not only describing what's going on, but it's also, again, just like highlighting this good outcome of this program. So again, this is where the subjectivity part of our charts come in. So here we see the distribution of rebates that are being issued to different people of different income levels. So you can see here that between 2012 and 2017, the percent of people that make less than 200,000 US dollars increased by a little less than 25%, which honestly is amazing when it comes to government and implementing equity-focused programs. The fact that we do see a market response in 5 years is almost unheard of. So that was one thing we wanted to focus on. All right, and this is the second example, and this is actually looking at renters versus owners. So California is really interesting in that only about half of the people that live in that state actually own their home. It is an extremely high figure, and it's very much an outlier in the United States. So here we're trying to highlight that a lot of people that are participating in this program do own their apartments or do own their houses, but only around 22% of people are renting. So here's an opportunity to change our outreach to try and engage people that are leasing their apartments and trying to figure out, is the barrier, again, income, maybe cash liquidity, and like other things in terms of why people are not trying to engage with electric vehicles and more sustainable energy sources. So that is one way we're trying to highlight gaps or improvements we could be doing. All right, so one thing that we definitely try and do is to stay up to date on language. This is a huge part of our work, and we actually have an entire other survey team that is doing outreach and trying to interface with advocacy groups and develop ways to measure people's involvement in the program. I am just visualizing it. So the first one, you'll see there are two lists. So we have the survey options for 2013 and 2015, and then on the right side, you'll see the options for 2020 to 2021. And you'll see that the options on 2021 are a lot longer. So we're trying to introduce different languages to try to measure different equity groups as the time changes. This is also really important because for the second option, you'll see that this was a recent a headline for the PBS, which is basically saying that the Biden administration wants to, again, modify this decennial census and change how we're categorizing race and ethnicity. This is a huge equity metric, and this has changed multiple times in the past few decades. So basically what they're doing is flip-flopping in how they're categorizing race and ethnicity. Sometimes they're grouped together, sometimes they're not. Certain races and ethnicities are acknowledged, and sometimes they're not. So this is a huge kind of problem, if I can say that, and that you do have to stay on top of how things are categorized and how things are labeled in the contemporary times when you're reporting time or data over time. All right, so ordering the data, there is an inherent bias of how things are perceived when you're ordering data. So things that are listed at the top are often seen as more important or just more pervasive than the ones listed on the bottom. So we do try to make an effort to list things in a reasonable fashion. So we are going to make a decision to number it numerically, alphabetically, chronologically, in ascending or descending order. And we want to make sure that we're making a choice and being able to defend it. Now, this other aspect is going to be this other category, which me and our survey group have had many lively discussions about, and people, I'm sure, have written entire theses about it. But basically, using this other category, on one hand, as data visualizers, can help us tidy up these data visualizations, can help us reduce lines, can help make things a little bit clearer for users. But on the other hand, it can also hide things, it can be exclusionary, and honestly, no one wants to be called other. So this is where we're trying to consider what other labels are available, what labels are acceptable to those communities, are there ways that we can incorporate them into our data, and also trying to figure out the best way to show the full range, the full spectrum of equity data. So my favorite thing would probably be just to offer a free-form response, like how do you identify yourself? Our data engineering team would not agree with me when it comes to data cleaning, but I think honestly, moving in that direction would be the best route. We'll see if I can convince them. All right. So getting into actual visualizations, this is our starting point. These are all interactive dashboards that are hosted by Tableau for the left two, and then ArcGIS and Java on the right, and they're 5+ years old. So this is kind of where we're starting and where we're trying to improve upon. On the far left, you'll see a page that describes equity statistics from the program, and it only really has that visual at the top that defines what equity means within this program, and then below that, it's a table. So not very intuitive, and there's not really a lot you can do with that data when it comes to analyzing it. In the middle here, we have the survey results, and we have our lovely stacked bar charts that are very difficult to read, and honestly, they only show a single metric at a time. There's a parameter at the top that you can change, but there's not a really good way to get a cool picture of what this population looks like because it has one metric. Now, on the far right, you'll see that there's a map, and it shows disadvantaged communities, or DACs as I might call them, in blue. So again, these are kind of difficult to see. They're very small, they're not outlined very well. So we're not doing a very good job highlighting them or bringing them to the forefront here. So this is my blank canvas, and we'll see what changes we can make. Now, all of these visualizations are basically me spitballing and whiteboarding and trying to get our team to approve, because when we make these changes to this dashboard, we have to make sure that the program itself, and then above them, usually the California boards have to approve them. So this is all a work in progress. So honestly, if you guys have any opinions or recommendations, please let me know, because we have time to make those changes before the board gets ahead of it. All right, with that said, the first chart that I really like is this proportion plot. This is one thing that I was introduced to by Stephanie Evergreen, and I just really like it because it really simplifies this distinction between sample and population. So here we can see that, at a glance, these lines are not flat. The items or the distribution from the left to the right is not equal, which means that when you read the text on the chart, that the ones on the left are the California population, on the right is the program population participating in our program. So you can see here that there's a lot more blue, where people are identifying as male are more likely to participate in our program than otherwise. So because these lines are not perfectly flat, that means that our program participation is slightly skewed for this equity metric, and again, is an opportunity to change, to modify outreach, to try and include other people. This other chart is again growing in popularity and is again one of my favorites. So using a B-swarm to visualize the full breadth of data variation, and it helps basically combat stereotypes, where if you're reporting a single metric, you're not being very transparent when it comes to showing everyone that's been involved in the program. And you can honestly see that the lines here that dictate what the averages are, there are very few points that actually overlap that line. There are very few people that are actually representative of the average, and that's something that we want to show to policymakers. This other one is small multiples. This one isn't as helpful, I don't think, because it takes up a lot of room, but it can be really helpful to kind of break things down and let people see distinct populations without having to worry about over-cluttering, like throwing too many lines on a chart, keeping things a little bit separate, and to avoid comparing equity metrics against each other. For example, races, gender, educational attainment, we want to keep those separate and then compare them to kind of an objective average. In this case, we're actually looking at DAC rebates in DAC communities over time and different utility districts. So by breaking them apart, we're seeing how different regions are behaving without having to worry about parsing out different colors and making sure we're tracking lines properly. All right, and I think this is one of the last ones, and this is just a simple back-to-back bar chart. As much as I would love to avoid bar charts in my everyday work, it is probably the most requested visualization that we get from policymakers, so I'm trying to work with what I got. So this here is basically a cluster of bar charts that basically help provide a picture of what a population is. We're still showing the full distribution of the data. We're trying to avoid reporting single metrics and averages, but still highlighting what those could be or what the most common value is. But then instead of also just reporting one metric, we're trying to show 3 or 4 at a time. So it's an easier image to grasp because you're seeing a community, not just an age range. That's something that you have to filter and change or change images. You can see age ranges, income, education at a glance, and understand the differences between these populations. This is further exemplified here, which is the item to the left is a stacked bar chart that currently exists on our dashboard, and is something that we're trying to fix because it shows distribution over time, but it's one metric at a time, and it's honestly not that clear and to read. There's no really descriptive text, so I think there's a lot of changes that could be made and improvements by using these stacked bar charts, or these other bar charts. All right, so using colors. This is, again, something that you could probably devote an entire different talk to, so I will just use one slide, and hopefully that's enough. But basically, the premise is using different hues, different tints, to clarify colors if they happen to change all the way to grayscale. This is an accessibility feature when it comes to color blindness. And the reason that I like to quote, get it right in black and white, is because if someone prints your dashboard out in black and white, which has happened to me before, and baby Kaitlyn did not know what was going on and had those colors, so that did not work out for me well. So I very quickly learned that we need to adjust our color theory, adjust our color scale, so that if it happens again, which I swear to God, if it does, I will be sending so many emails. So that if it does happen, the item on the right will still show some differences in hue and different colors, so it's different grays, but it's also directly labeled so that the colors aren't really the most important, nor the only text being shown. All right, so one of the last things I have here are, again, providing the narrative and context to emphasize the story that we're trying to tell. John kind of covered this in his early keynote, so thank you for that. But basically, it's using descriptive text to add different contexts and tell the story that we're trying to tell. So here, I have zoomed in on some visualizations to show some of the ancillary information that we're providing. The top being the actual survey question that rebates are being offered, and then at the bottom providing contemporary context as to why are those the only responses, anything that was removed, for example, survey responses that just did not respond or removed from this visualization. So providing that additional context helps things be a little bit clearer. And the other thing that we've been trying to implement is adding descriptive and alternative text, not only to the framing of the chart, but also embedded in the coding behind it, so that users that are completely sight impaired can use screen readers, such as I think Microsoft Narrator, to go through and use keyboard navigation and have the screen and computer read the results of this chart to them. All right, so looking back, kind of the main takeaways that I'm hoping that I got across was, one, the importance of defining what equity means. It changes between context quite consistently, and it's important to understand before you even start developing any charts. The second is to try and embrace diversity within your data by using things like the B-swarm, the bar chart, and really highlighting that very few people actually match the average. And then lastly, understanding that I would like to say not all visualizations in my line of work are subjective, and that we need to acknowledge as advocates the story that we're telling. So that is what I have. The last thing that I do want to leave off on is that this is not a complete picture. This is still, we are in the middle of the road. We're still, Kingdom of Oz is very, very far away. We're still trying to make our way back home. And we have all of these things that we're trying to accomplish in the next few months. And the whole list didn't even fit on here. But what I'm trying to get across to my team, to my advocates, and to policymakers is that these charts are not a once and done, this is the answer, this is what you need to know. It's supposed to spark conversations and to try to convince people to embrace equity as a good thing, and to try to make improvements to their program to reach more people that need help. All right, so with that, I will finish.
Any challenges that you face when you are training non-data people or people who are not so much aware of how accessibility should work, or how the charts have this cultural sensitivity, or in this not cultural, graphical sensitivity?
So which one works? Is the mic on? Haha, okay. So that is a really good question, and honestly something that we run into constantly. We do mostly internal trainings. We speak with members not only of our data team, but also outside of just transparency and insights, so that people understand what we're putting out and how much actually work goes into it. One thing with the accessibility features is there's a lot of work that goes into it and is not usually, visible. It's not readily apparent how much work goes into adding descriptive text, making sure the colors match, making sure that everything is, visible for people who may or may not be, abled. So that is one thing that we're trying to get across to these teams and to explain why our budgets are expanding and why we're asking for more time, and we keep getting pushback, but our team is growing. We actually have, I have a partner who is completely devoted to accessibility, so that is her job while I do the equity side of things, and together I think we're making headway.
Great, good to know. Do we have a question over there? Sorry, first this one, I didn't see it, and then.
Hi, Kaitlyn. Thanks so much. I also work in an environmental nonprofit, so this was spot on.
I love it.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to altering your charts to reach different populations. I mean, I imagine, if you're talking to politicians, policymakers, the charts are going to look a lot more different than to the communities that you're trying to reach.
Absolutely. And honestly, the examples that we were showing here from the dashboards have to walk that line because they're published on the public website. So both the public, advocacy groups, policymakers all reference them. So it's definitely a kind of cost-benefit analysis that we have to do to make those decisions and make sure we're documenting why we're making them. When it comes to policymakers, we can kind of skew things more and they'll make things a little bit, I guess, more pointed, more, this is the message we're trying to get across than we would public-facing, because we're pulling some visualizations for reports or for presentations strictly for them. But when it comes to the dashboards, it's a very fine line that we're walking. And I don't know, that probably doesn't help, but it's very subjective and every conversation changes.
We have an online question from Lisa Pedersen. You mentioned that you try to avoid bar charts in your work. Could you elaborate on why you prefer to avoid bar charts?
I do not. I think I definitely got bar chart fatigue very early on in this position, and I made it a very short campaign to try to not incorporate bar charts in things that I did, which ended very quickly. Mostly because people above me are very comfortable with them. They know that the politicians can glance at them and immediately get a takeaway. The people that we're trying to reach, advocacy groups, may not have the graph literacy that we would expect from policymakers. So even then, it's a lot clearer for them to understand what's going on by using these very simple, familiar bar charts.
Another one? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I think it's brilliant to have this perspective on visualization regarding either how we present in an equity way or how we present our content in an equity way. But here I can relate the question with what John was talking about non-chart people, because big part of charts that usually they reach audience who are with some level of education. When it comes to public audience, we need to acknowledge that some people, they have the right to be informed, as if we talk about journalism, for example, but charts could be complicated. And I guess the question here is what is the middle ground between making charts but make it as accessible as possible, as equitable for people who should be informed, as responsibility as to inform, but in a way to convey to them?
Absolutely. It's a really good question. And I think it changes depending on the product we're providing. So the dashboards, which are mostly what I work on, are going to be public-facing. People who are probably not going to find them or even look for them unless they are chart people, unless they are data people. So we're not too concerned about that. What we're trying to get into actually is working with our outreach and community groups so that when we meet with advocacy groups throughout California, we're there side by side to say, this is the product that we can offer you. We can offer trainings. We can tell you how to read the data that is impacting your community. So that's kind of the direction we're moving. We recently made a few hires. Again, my team is 3, which is new. So with all 3 of us, I'm really hoping that we can make a bigger impact and start having these conversations across CSC instead of just in our little corner.
Well, Thank you very much. I know there are probably more questions, but we are running out of time, so feel free to reach out to Kaitlyn. Thank you very much.
Thank you.